jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljoravnih ljudi. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, Dita!
เ
самый как край, южный гордо северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога.
To turn the mic on. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along. It is, of course, the 8th of March 2024, and we come to you today, of course, on International Working Women's Day, a day which, of course, started off, if you follow it back, all the way into the days of the early socialist movement in the United States, where it was a day designed to promote the cause of female suffrage. And according to most popularly recorded history, it began in a period of time when the Socialist Party of the United States was very much an up-and-coming force associated with people, of course, like Daniel de Leon. And in 1908, the Socialist Party of the US formed a Women's National Committee, which called for the party to designate one day per year for the purposes of campaigning for women's suffrage. So National Women's Day began in 1909 in the United States. So if you're in the US, you were in the lead on that one. And it's, of course, worth remembering that many people suspected that the first socialist revolution would actually happen inside the United States prior to World War I. And the Second International, which at the time was still worthy of the name, in a way, took this up and later decreed that there would be an International Women's Day that was held or declared at the first conference that the Second International organized, a conference of socialist women that was held on the 26th to the 27th of August 1910. And after that, International Women's Day became established. So it is something which comes out of the workers' movement and comes out of course, socialism, and was turned into a very much a major event in the former Soviet Union. It was declared International Working Women's Day by communists, and it was something which, of course, coincides in a major way with the story of the Russian Revolution, the story of the beginnings of the revolution that was to lead to the establishment of the Soviet Union. So the February Revolution begins, of course, in the old style calendar on February the 24th, which of course marks the 8th in the new style. And according to which version of the history you read, but there is a commonality here, that the revolution was begun by women workers in Petrograd, as it was called then, and it was begun as it started as a protest over the chronic lack of bread, which the Tsarist regime, of course, was incapable of supplying even the most basic of necessities anymore to the major cities. The economy and industry were essentially collapsing under the strains of World War I. And the society of the Russian Empire was coming apart at the seams, and so the discontented women workers of Petrograd, by staging a protest which turned into a riot, which turned into a citywide uprising, which ultimately triggered the abdication of the Tsar, the end of the Tsardom, much to the bitter regrets of Russian reactionaries and reactionaries further afield to this day, and started the process by which the working class would ultimately seize power in October of that year, or November if you go off the new style. So the whole question of the creation of the Soviet power, the beginning of the revolutionary process, or the renewal of the Russian revolutionary process, I should say, in February of 1917, came from the actions of women workers. And that's why I've used the old Mao quote for the title of this episode, which is, of course, "Women hold up half the sky." Now, I wanted to just mention a couple of things before we get into the actual issue here, which is, of course, the old perennial distinction between communism and, well, feminism, particularly of the most bourgeois kind. So I want to read a little bit here from another great Russian revolutionary, Alexandra Kollontai, who went from being a revolutionary agitator to being a key member of the Soviet government to being pursuing a long and very distinguished career in the Soviet diplomatic corps, which reached its high point when she was running intelligence networks inside the Nordic countries out of Sweden when she was on the diplomatic staff there, and ultimately she became ambassador of the Soviet government to Sweden. And after her retirement, she stayed on as an informal advisor to Vyacheslav Molotov. And throughout World War II, she, of course, when she was based in Sweden, ran apparently intelligence networks there, was something of a spy master, and also conducted secret talks with the authorities, the Germans, always at certain points in 43 and 44, when the Hitlerites realized they were losing and tried to sue for peace, but of course could never deliver terms that would be acceptable to the Soviet Union. So Kollontai was somebody who was not only a great revolutionary, but pursued a very varied and interesting and very important career in the Soviet government after she had engaged in the controversy over the trade union issue in the early 1920s. Unlike Trotsky, she accepted that she had lost, her side had lost the vote in 1921 on the trade union question, and she went and pursued a form of work inside the Soviet diplomatic service, which ultimately proved very important. So you should always contrast the trajectories of Trotsky and the trajectory of Kollontai, who were both in a minority in the early 1920s, but Kollontai accepted that she had been and still made an absolutely vital contribution to the building of the Soviet state and the Soviet diplomatic service as well. So, and a very important person in terms of the history of the Russian Revolution. But we go back to 1913 for the extract I'm going to read from her works here, which is about Women's Day, as she calls it in the article. And I will read to you from the conclusion of that article, because I think it raises some important distinctions. A quote reads as follows: "Thus, as members of the party, women workers are fighting for the common class cause, while at the same time outlining and putting forward those needs and demands that most nearly affect themselves as women, housewives and mothers. The party supports these demands and fights for them. The requirements of working women are part and parcel of the common workers' cause. On Women's Day, the organised demonstrate their lack of rights. But some will say, why this singling out of women workers? Why special women's days, special leaflets for working women, meetings and conferences of working class women? Is this not in the final analysis a concession to the feminists and bourgeois suffragettes? Only those who do not understand the radical difference between the movement of socialist women and bourgeois suffragettes can think this way. What is the aim of the feminists? Their aim is to achieve the same advantages, the same power, the same rights within capitalist society as those possessed now by their husbands, fathers and brothers. What is the aim of the women workers? Their aim is to abolish all privileges deriving from birth or wealth. For the women worker, it is a matter of indifference who is the master, a man or a woman. Together with the whole of her class, she can ease her position as a worker. Feminists demand equal rights always and everywhere. Women workers reply, we demand rights for every citizen, man and woman, but we are not prepared to forget that we are not only workers and citizens, but also mothers. And as mothers, as women who give birth to the future, we demand special concern for ourselves and our children, special protection from the state and society. The feminists are striving to acquire political rights. However, here too our paths separate. For bourgeois women, political rights are simply a means allowing them to make their way more conveniently and more securely in a world founded on the exploitation of the working people. For women workers, political rights are a step along the rocky and difficult path that leads to the desired kingdom of labour. The paths pursued by women workers and bourgeois suffragettes have long since separated. There is too great a difference between the objectives that life has put before them. There is too great a contradiction between the interests of the women worker and the lady proprietress, between the servant and her mistress. There are not and cannot be any points of contact, conciliation or convergence between them. Therefore, working men should not fear separate women's days or special conferences of women workers, nor their special press. Every special distinct form of work among the women of the working class is simply a means of arousing the consciousness of the woman worker and drawing her into the ranks of those fighting for a better future. Women's days and the slow, meticulous work undertaken to arouse the self-consciousness of the women worker are serving the cause not of the division but of the unification of the working class. Let a joyous sense of serving the common class cause and of fighting simultaneously for their own female emancipation inspire women workers to join in the celebration of Women's Day. And there, I think some very important distinctions can be made. And the distinctions made by Alexandra Kollontai in that piece of writing from 1913, of course, have been buried and forgotten in more recent years, when, of course, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the triumph of the bourgeois thought includes, of course, the triumph of the bourgeois version of feminism and of course, various split-offs from that have broken out over the last 30 to 40 years. And so this is the distinction that I want to draw today and talk about. But before we get anywhere else, we will do the customary greeting of those who are in the chat so far. So we have Steve Choate, who's with us, and Jerry, and Carmo, and Ian Foster. Albert Roundtree says, "Good afternoon, comrades, workers of the world unite." Otis says, "A very good morning and afternoon," and good morning, afternoon, good evening, good night to you anywhere in the world. I've inadvertently quoted The Truman Show. Hello to Lisa and Gracinol and Svetlana, who says, "Communist greetings from Moscow. Happy International Women's Day to all women worldwide." Indeed. Gracinol, hello to you. Luca, who says, "Afternoon, tuning in during my late lunch break. Good to have you with us." And Kent, who says, "Good morning from Minneapolis." And Red Star Betty, who has joined us. Good to have you with us. And Jean John, who says, "Hello from Hyderabad." Well, good to have you with us, all the way from Pakistan. And we have One Straw, who says, "Greetings from Central California. Taking a short break from reading Professor Andrea Ricci's Value and Unequal Exchange in International Trade. Highly recommended. No pasaran." Good to have you here. Hello to Slava, who joins us, and to Irish Partisan, and to A.J. Williamson, and to Dingo Ate Me Baby, the man with the greatest name on the internet, and Ben, who joins us from Hungary, and XYZ, who quotes Mao just as I did. And literally anything but that says, "Many Canadian bourgeois suffragettes were heavily involved in the eugenics movement." Very true. Svetlana says, "Some of the English bourgeois suffragettes later joined Mosley's black shirts. They wanted the vote for themselves, but not for working class women." Indeed. Afternoon to Tom from Gloucestershire. Clinton Frazier says, "Greetings from the Kinstone Rockers." Cobra Commander says, "This is the problem. Communism deals with materialism, and it's very easy to take the group like women or LGBT and even a race and subvert it to pure idealism," which is exactly what's happened. So it is to that particular point that we will turn. which is, of course, that in the early days of the 20th century, the distinction that Kollontai drew there was actually quite clear and obvious, which is that there was a very clear class distinction in Britain between the likes of Emmeline Pankhurst, who was, of course, the leader of the women's suffrage movement in Britain, Women's Social and Political Union, and many of the people who agreed with her on that point, including her own daughter, Sylvia Pankhurst, took a radically different view. In fact, Sylvia Pankhurst went on to become one of the founders of the old Communist Party of Great Britain. But some of them, including, Pankhurst herself, was of very reactionary points of view on many other issues. And of course, as the point is made in the chat by Svetlana, the question of the distinction between the bourgeois and the proletarian women is something which was and indeed is incredibly obvious. But that's been lost, in my view, in leftist discourse over the last 60 years or so, since the middle 1960s. Because what you've lost there is the clarity of thought expressed there by Alexandra Kollontai and also by women like Clara Zetkin. The clear distinction between the bourgeois and the proletarian movements there. That all got lost post-World War II when bourgeois trends came to dominate leftist thought. And I'll just pause here briefly to explain a little bit about why this happened. You see, the history of particularly academic thought in the West, particularly that which is identified as Marxist, and even that which is not in bourgeois academia, but within the trade unions, came to be dominated increasingly after World War II, not by, of course, workers, but by those who had left the working class, those who had started off within the working class, but due to the concessions made in the social democratic period, managed to elevate themselves out of the working class and into an economic atmosphere that's more akin to the petty bourgeoisie, or the lower end of the petty bourgeoisie at least. And so what you find is that the expressions of what's known as Western Marxism, and including the theories which are meant to apply to women, lose their class distinction more and more as the 1960s go on, and start to take on more and more of the tenor of bourgeois thought than proletarian thought. In fact, proletarian ideology as a distinct thing in the West gets almost destroyed in the post-war era. And that's a direct byproduct of the social democratic period, which is that prior to 1945, there were more of a distinct sphere of proletarian thought, more of a distinct sphere of that existed in the old communist parties, even in Britain, where the Communist Party was quite small, breaking open a space for the working class thought, working class culture, for proletarian ideology to be created and recreated outside of the structures of the state. That was something which the Communist Party was actually concerned with. Now, one of the clever things the bourgeois managed to do, whether this was by design or perhaps just from their point of view a happy accident, was that they, by creating and by expanding the educational institutions post-World War II, and by making sure that they recruited more teachers in higher and further education, by doing all of this, what they managed to do was they managed to squeeze out slowly the areas that had been cultivated by the communist parties, where proletarian ideology was cultivated separate to and aside from the state. Now, what I mean by this is that the state essentially takes over and occupies the spaces that the intellectual spaces that used to be operated outside of or away from the aegis of the bourgeois state. and they bring this into the state machine, the state setup post 1945. And so what you get post 1945 is that the intelligentsia that used to group around the Communist Party in Britain, and I think it's the same is true in France and Italy, and maybe in the United States as well, though I think the severe anti-communist purge might have affected this differently. What you get, though, is that what used to exist as proletarian thought, proletarian culture outside of the state gets brought in a watered down form into the state and is then controlled by it. Now, how does this link back to the distinction between proletarian and bourgeois ideology when it comes to women? Well, what happens is that the forms of thought that people like Kollontai and Zetkin represented, where they were able to draw clear distinctions between the bourgeois feminists and the proletarian approach to women's issues, that starts to dissipate post-World War II, especially in the imperialist countries, because the intellectual apparatus of the old communist parties had, to a large extent, been incorporated into the state system. It had been incorporated into bourgeois academia. They'd been incorporated into various different areas of the bourgeois, to use the old Jürgen Habermas term, public sphere. Now, this matters because what happens is that once that layer which was responsible for creating and recreating proletarian thought, or at least putting it into practice or putting it into written form, that layer starts to look less to the organized working class and more to the state as the guarantor of their employment, of their income, and it helps to bring in more and more bourgeois ideology into what was previously as spaces where a proletarian approach could be taken. Now, what does this mean in terms of the emancipation of women, so-called, or the reactionary changes that have taken place over the last 30 years? What starts to happen in the 60s is, of course, post-World War II, you get a hell of a lot of women coming into the workplace, more and more and more. And, of course, you get, by the end of the 1960s, the formal acknowledgement, at least in Britain, in the late 60s, early 70s, you get a formal acknowledgement of the what is supposed to be equality in the workplace. So equal pay claims start being brought. There was big equal pay strikes in the late 1960s in Britain, including the famous one at the Ford Motor Company plant in Dagenham, which is, of course, the southeast of England. So what this means is that you get the mass entry of women workers into the workplace. And, of course, at this point, if I was an extremely online YouTube reactionary, I'd start screaming about how women were used to lower the wages of men. But, of course, as always is the case with extremely online reactionaries, they take a certain aspect of the truth and abstract it, then elevate it into their worldview. Because the entry of women into the workplace, of course, if it's not conducted as part of as Kollontai indicates in that passage I started this program by reading out to you, if it's not part of a much wider struggle across the whole working class, then it's something which is going to get subverted by the bourgeoisie. So the entry of women into the workforce is a progressive event, undoubtedly. The incorporation of women more solidly into the proletariat, though, of course, the myth of the non-working stay-at-home woman being the mainstay in proletarian households is just that. It is a myth. Like all of the, for instance, all of my grandmothers all worked throughout their lives, going back, and that's going back like to the 1930s. Prior to that, like the women workers were crucial in the Industrial Revolution. They were crucial in industries such as cotton spinning, such as also coal mining, up to the later 19th century and even into the 20th. Women were mainstays in the coal pits in Britain. It wasn't until like the later 19th that they stopped serving below ground with the men and were taken out of that and then taken above ground to do only above ground duties. But in the early to the middle 19th century in Britain, women worked alongside men as coal miners, and often stripped to the waist and sweating away down there just as any man would. And of course, nobody saw any distinction back then. The capitalists certainly didn't care. It was only when you got the Victorian social reformers much later in the 19th century who were campaigned, quite rightly, raising points about child labour and took umbrage with the idea that women were working in these mines on the same basis as men were. But even up until the 1930s, women worked in the coal industry, often above ground, sorting through coal, sorting out by hand that which was usable and that which was not usable. So this idea that that reactionaries have these days, that there was a point in British proletarian life where the overwhelming majority of women just simply did not work at all. This isn't true. This is true in the case of a small minority of the British working class that were particularly, where the man was particularly well paid in the period after, say, 1945 through to about 1970, 75. So there was like a generation where a small minority of the working class, the very much better paid end, the skilled working class man, could support a wife and 2 children on a single wage. But that, again, I emphasize, that was a minority of the working class. It didn't apply to the overwhelming majority of the working class in this country, where women at least worked part-time alongside raising the children. And this is the one of the myths that the reactionaries like to dwell upon, that women just didn't work at all prior to about 1968, where not only did women enter the workforce, but by doing so they also introduced gayness into the world and everything went to hell or something. But the point being is that capital, of course, when more and more women entered the workplace on a full-time basis, and in an imperialist country like Britain, which was becoming more and more white collar and less industrial, the distinction between typical male and female occupations starts to be collapsed as more and more men enter into purely what were considered white collar occupations, and women, of course, are in those on the same, entering into them on the same basis, on the same level. So what's true is that the women and men workers were now doing not separate jobs. It wasn't that the women were all in the typing pool anymore. It's that they were overwhelmingly doing jobs that were of a similar level, requiring a similar level of skill, or a similar low level of skill perhaps, and were entering into these jobs on the same basis to do the same thing. So the distinction between male and female labour in many areas of the economy got collapsed by deindustrialization and by the proletarianization of what had once been prestigious, largely male white-collar occupations, such as civil service, such as anything in the public sector that used to be sort of clerical jobs that had been dominated by men for a long time. Now they were done equally by both men and women. And so what you get, of course, during this, over the course of the last 50 years, is of course a lot of occupations that used to be better paid getting more and more de-skilled and proletarianized. At the same time that a lot of women enter into them. It's not the women entering into them that's proletarianized it. It's that's part of this process of proletarianization of previously more skilled and more prestigious occupations that's going on everywhere. If you look at like the way that the teaching profession has gone, the medical profession has gone, and various other aspects of the economy, such as architects, such as those employed in the trade of writing, commercial writers. All of these used to be more privileged occupations. All of them now have been leveled down and getting more thoroughly proletarianized. And this happens at the same time, of course, you find more and more women entering into them. So reactionaries say, it's because women are there now, lowering the wages. No, the wages are being lowered because of the way in which the capitalist economy has developed over the last 50 years, which is, of course, as Marx notes in his writings from the 1840s onwards, has seen wave upon wave of automation, which results in wave upon wave of de-skilling, which results in people being tossed out of work, previously skilled jobs getting de-skilled, and therefore being able to employ people to do them on lower wages than were previously available. And of course, deindustrialization is part of the process of imperialism, leading, of course, to a hollowing out of the economies of the advanced imperialist countries, and the replacement of manufacturing jobs with service sector jobs, which, of course, are open to men and women on an equal basis, leading to what was the fantasy of the massed ranks of the proletariat, where no women worked and all men went to work with a tin lunchbox every day and just did his 9 to 5 and came home. Well, the layer that applied to is now gone. That's very much not the case anymore. But again, this isn't because women entered the workplace. This is because of the process of the declining rate of profit, the deindustrialization process that follows, the changeover to a purely service-based and speculative economies. This runs alongside the entry of women into the workplace on a mass basis. And so reactionaries blame women for the way in which this has developed. But of course, reactionaries don't generally like looking at their beloved capitalism for the actual cause of the immiseration that they're protesting about. But what has this done in terms of the position of women workers over the last, let's say, 50 years? Now, with deindustrialization, with casualization, with the relentless lowering or the suppression of wages, and of course the destabilization that follows from that, the fact that the families now have to have 2 people working full time just to be able to keep their heads above water. Well, all of that leads to a situation of extreme instability, extreme alienation. And alongside this process that I've just been describing runs, of course, a cultural rot as well within the imperialist countries. So that's why you get like what you would previously refer to as like examples of feminist thought degenerating alongside the rest of professional leftism. Now, bear in mind what I said about professional leftism sort of being, or Western Marxism, you can include in this, being spawned by the social democratic period, being taken from what was previously spaces that were around communist parties and trade unions and taken to and incorporated within the state. And because they're incorporated into the bourgeois state, they of course take on more and more bourgeois trends. So when you're looking at the way in which feminism or various pieces of feminist thought start to degenerate throughout the 90s and 2000s, it's because they're completely separated from the working class. They've got unlike people like Kollontai and Zetkin, who might have come from lower petty bourgeois backgrounds, but were thoroughly immersed in working class culture. All forms of intellectual output, especially those, in fact, on the left in the 90s and the 2000s, became ever more alienated from the working class, started to exist purely for the edification of the petty bourgeoisie and certain elements of the bourgeoisie. And so feminist thought, and particularly even those who describe themselves as left or socialist feminists or something, basically just took on the role of watching the slow and, well, not too slow, but the actually quite rapid degeneration of of what was supposed to be the sexual revolution into apologetics for the porn industry, and into apologetics for like this completely debased culture that was growing up. And the way in which a lot of the former feminists and academic leftists decided to go in the 1990s, 2000s, and up to today is to look at all this cultural rot and degeneration and say, well, that's actually good. Well, it's actually good that more and more women are trying to make ends meet by selling themselves by the second and the minute and the hour on OnlyFans. Well, it's actually good that all these guys are spending loads of time watching pornography. It's actually good that we've now got very strange men declaring that they can become women just because of a thought that's in their heads. That's basically the output of Verso books, if you're familiar with them. So the way in which all of this now sort of petty bourgeois leftist thought has completely degenerated has made it into basically just a useful tool of the bourgeoisie. It went from trying to develop critiques of consumer society, even Adorno and Horkheimer and people like that, when academic sort of Western Marxism was growing into a thing in the 1950s and 60s, that they at least proclaimed that it was their intention to critique mass consumer society. By the 1990s, all that academic Marxism and Western Marxism is doing is looking at the degeneration of the culture and going, yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's great. But why is it then that the much promised so-called sexual liberation of the 1960s turns into this dystopian nightmare of OnlyFans basically today? And it's because, again, to go back to how this was formulated, the theories around this were formulated by academics who might have at one point identified as Marxists or some form of leftist, but again, they made what is essentially a classical, very liberal mistake. And they, of course, ceased to be Marxists long ago, in that many of these theorists who advocated for the sexual revolution under capitalism made the cardinal error of abstracting sexual relations from the wider relations of capitalist production. And if you do that, what you're essentially going to end up doing is apologetics for capitalism. If you try and abstract a single social issue or any issue and treat it as something that is aside from or not intricately related to the relationship that we have with the means of production, the way in which such things are filtered through class distinctions, the way that culture is ultimately rooted in the class upon which society is built and the class upon which which rules, and the contradictions between them, and the way in which to go back to the old division, the superstructure might reflect back into the economic base, but it does still originate from the economic base. And if you take away all of those basic understandings that you have to do a real dialectical materialist analysis of any question to actually practice scientific socialism, if you take away that and try to abstract one particular problem and to then work on that problem in isolation from the relations of production, then what you are essentially doing is you are collapsing into bourgeois thought, which is what a lot of these so-called these leftists, these academic Marxists did in the 60s and the 70s. And by the time you get to the 80s, you've just got complete degeneration. So this is how you end up with like proclaimed Marxists, like those who write for Verso, doing apologetics for gender ideology, doing apologetics for the porn industry, saying, oh, it's great that OnlyFans enables women to liberate themselves via selling pictures to weirdos online and stuff like that. It's how you end up with like these various leftists endorsing things like prostitution, which all of the women of the early Bolshevik movement, the early years of the Soviet Union, like Kollontai, like Zetkin and others, would have been absolutely horrified by the endorsement of prostitution, which was regarded rightly as a real horrible social ill. There's nothing empowering about it. Now, I don't believe for a second that the bourgeois state has any real solution to offer women who are trapped into prostitution, but certainly it's the case that by doing these apologetics for it, by proclaiming it that it can be liberatory or something like that, what the leftists in the United States and Britain have ended up doing is essentially acting as apologists for pimps. It's a surprise that many more of them aren't retweeting Andrew Tate. Well, perhaps they are. So, but this is what happens when your analysis becomes completely divorced from the working class, and you try and abstract your analysis from class relations and from the relations of production. And once you do that, you end up getting completely lost and end up in essentially a bourgeois liberal frame. So, and this is what has happened to all of the so-called feminist writers, or a lot of the feminist writers in the left spaces, shall we say, in so-called Marxist groups, where you'll get like Trotskyites now doing like long-winded defenses of prostitution, whereas in actual fact, what communists should say is that prostitution is a social ill, and under communism it must be stamped out. It must be something which is no longer practiced in a socialist society. It is something that is unacceptable. It obviously degrades still mostly women that are involved in it, but there are some men. That's important to note. And it also is something which fundamentally degrades the overwhelmingly men, by the way, who use and abuse these women. It is a degrading and debasing thing. And it is an evil that should be criticized properly, and that's something that we seek to stamp out under socialism. No Marxist of any serious kind should be looking at the way in which this culture has degenerated over the last 30 years and saying, oh yeah, it's good actually. But that is indeed what many of them are doing. And it is because they have ceased to believe in the working class as a revolutionary agent. Never mind working class women as a revolutionary agent. They now no longer see any hope of revolution at all, or in fact are actively opposed to it, despite calling themselves Marxists. They in actual fact end up clinging desperately to what they see as the more progressive side of the bourgeoisie. So those who fund the think tanks that advocate for freedom for prostitution, basically, or those who advocate for voting Democrat for progressive reasons. Perhaps many of them advocate for this, or choose to cover for this part of the bourgeoisie because they hope they might get a job out of it or a sinecure somewhere. Either way, though, this is the Western Marxist thought has, again, in the realm of women's rights, in the realm of the struggle of women workers, has found to be completely rotten and completely without value and needs to be thrown out. It is a complete disaster, but it springs from, again, problems in the separation of so-called academic thought away from the proletariat in the 40s, 50s and 60s of the last century, a failure to properly analyze what the so-called sexual revolution actually meant, which is that if you abstract it and the struggle for sexual equality and the true equality in relations between the sexes cannot be, of course, accomplished under capitalism, because of course the women might be in the workplace, women might be subject to laws proclaiming their formal equality, there might be equal pay laws, but of course the bourgeois family, as identified by Engels, is still very much there. Caring responsibilities still overwhelmingly fall upon women, only now they're having to work even longer hours, just as long as any man does, and still are left with the caring responsibilities both for of course, children, but also sick or older members of their families. And so this idea that you could look at the sex relation or sexual relations aside from all the other aspects of capitalist society, or aside from all the other class contradictions that go on, again, this is a completely non-dialectical analysis. It's fundamentally a liberal analysis. No matter how many pronouns or various different bits of Marxist terminology somebody tacks onto it. So The other thing to mention at this stage is, of course, that the way in which the socialist countries have dealt with these things, have dealt with the question of relations between the sexes, is also interesting to note and vital to note, given that there's been various studies done, including by the writer Kristen Godsey, who has some, shall we say, some strange opinions and other issues, but her book on what is it? Do women have better sex under socialism? Well, that contains some valuable information. And the fundamental point that she makes in that book, which I will have to reread at some point, is that because in East Germany in particular, where I think a lot of the study she was doing was taken from, because the rights of women there were far in advance, in actual fact, of the rights of women in West Germany, because there was no financial pressure on women to stay with male partners that were useless or abusive, or where the relationship between the two of them had consistently broken down, because they were able to divorce such a person and find somebody else or not, or whatever their preference in that situation was. It actually made for the basis for much more healthier relations between men and women, the removal of the financial peril that a woman might be in if she lost the income of a husband or partner. And of course, to answer the answer to her question of do women have better sex under socialism, the answer is that the relationship between the sexes is, of course, much more healthy when each has a solid job guaranteed to them, where each is able to live a life which is not permanently insecure, which is what you have now, where you can live, where you know you're always going to have a job, where you know that the amount which is expected to be taken from you in terms of payment for accommodation, food, etc., the essentials of life, where all of that is covered in a relatively inexpensive way due to the efficiencies of the planned economy, and then the formal legal equality between men and women has a more solid material basis. Because, of course, you can declare men and women to be equal under bourgeois law in the West. Doesn't mean that they are, because all of the relations of production compel women and men back towards creating and recreating versions of the bourgeois family, which, of course, is oppressive to women quite a lot of the time. And even under the situation of formal bourgeois equality, it is, because, well, how on earth are you going to enact that equality when workers are in such a precarious and economically insecure situation that it is often for material reasons that people get together and stay together, leading to perhaps a degree more financial stability, but on the emotional side of things, and therefore on the sexual side of things, the life that the two of them lead is often one of unsatisfaction, dissatisfaction, and often misery, and of course leading to situations of criminal abuse occurring, often directed from the man to the woman. So the formal bourgeois equality is something which is, again, to go back to what Kollontai was saying in that opening quote, it's something which is not possible to actually implement. It's something which benefits principally those who have already the access to enough capital to enforce that equality, i.e. bourgeois women, who have managed to benefit from the various different bourgeois feminist struggles over the course of the 20th century. So now they can all happily vote for Hillary Clinton. But the working class woman is, of course, left behind by all of this. And so we still haven't addressed the points made by Kollontai and Zetkin. Yes, things have gone forward to a degree, but as we can see from all the problems relating to degenerate late-stage monopoly capitalism, what's actually been created both economically and culturally in the later 20th and early 21st century are circumstances whereby the oppression of women returns, albeit in a new and more technologically advanced form. Under the socialist system, where you have a baseline of existence that is guaranteed in terms of jobs and economic support that no one can fall below, then women and men are both more free to make their choices on a romantic and emotional level, and therefore build more genuinely satisfying life partnerships than they are able to do under capitalism. And that is now an indisputable fact, given that we've now got the academic literature to look at, the studies to look at, and the various different systems that the socialist countries built. Now, recently, the liberals were all going crazy because the French had codified the right to abortion into the French constitution, missing out, of course, that Zambia had done this in the 1970s, as had Tito-ite Yugoslavia. Proof that the socialist period is just being written out of history by propagandists and their clueless liberal followers. So I'll go back now and cover some of the comments that have come in. Right, where are we? Okay, right, we got Ben here who says, all of the Western headlines on Women's Day are about gender and the threat of the anti-gender movement and climate madness. Women's representation in management, not women's liberation. Yeah, it's a purely bourgeois approach now. They've attempted to completely stamp out all of the proletarian set parts of this day. And of course, they're certainly not going to mention that the women's actions started the February Revolution or the socialist origins of International Women's Day. The Guardian might have a patronizing article about it. A case of the bourgeois taking something that the proletariat created and basically skinning it alive and then hanging the skin on the wall. Hello to Dan Lindstrom, who's joined us from occupied NATO, NATO-occupied Sweden. Oh, apparently I got the location of Hyderabad wrong. Hyderabad is in India. My apologies. I don't want to start a diplomatic incident. Marius, good afternoon to you, or indeed good morning if you're in the middle of the United States. Right. Ben says recommend Russia's beautiful promo video for Women's Day by Art Begma couple. Okay, interesting. Iris Partizan, who joined us from Minsk, says, in the 1930s, under the 5-year plan, Soviet women were encouraged to join the workforce where they learned how to read and write, offered the chance of third-level qualifications, especially in management. That's very true. In every, as I've been indicating in my previous comments, in every society where there was a socialist revolution in the 20th century, the position of women was always prioritized in terms of the incorporation of women in the proletariat, but also the raising of the cultural level of women to remove the historic inequalities there. It can be measured as to how damaging things like the counter-revolution of 1989 to 91 was. After that, after what happened there and the collapse of socialism in Russia, where the position of women in Russia in the 1990s drastically declined. I'm not completely familiar with if that has been improved in recent years, but certainly there was a shocking decline in women's position when the counter-revolution went through. Right. Marius says, the way reactionaries blame women for the effects of neoliberalism they find distasteful is very similar to the way they blame immigrants, an easy scapegoat. Yeah, reactionaries will blame anything other than capitalism itself. Women, immigrants, gays, I don't know, they'll blame cultural degeneration on like leftist activist shareholders at Disney or something, anything other than looking at capitalism itself. Iris Partizan says, Soviet enterprises also set up kindergartens and nurseries for young children and access to healthcare. Stalin ordered that the canteens be built so that the workforce could be properly fed. Yes, so the Soviet canteen was a real legacy of the USSR. And also this was true of the DDR as well, which I think had very extensive childcare facilities that were acknowledged as being some of the best in the world, even by bourgeois experts from the West. And of course, enable women to leave their children in safe places with people that they trusted in order that they could carry on working and that their working life wasn't held back by having children, but they could have children. They could, again, choose to take time off from work to do the raising of children, and when they were ready, they could go back and not suffer penalties from at the workplace from having to take time off to care for their children. Like, all of this is not available in the West, or if it is, it's only available to like bourgeois women. In places that I've worked, even those that have on paper progressive policies when it comes to maternity and paternity leave, in actual fact, getting those enforced is a real bureaucratic battle. And also, women taking 9 months to a year off to actually claim their maternity leave always actually damages their working prospects. So often they'll come back and they'll find that even though they haven't been made redundant, because that's illegal, their position in the team that they worked in has gone, that they are now on other worse duties, that they may have a job, but it's not the job that they left due to reorganizations. I remember a case that I had which went to an employment tribunal involving just this. A woman came back from having children. She found that the job that she used to do had been eliminated, but they hadn't broken the law because she'd not been made redundant. They just destroyed the team that she used to work in and put her on new duties which she wasn't trained for. And because she wasn't trained for them, she couldn't actually cover them properly. And because she couldn't cover them properly, the manager of that particular section essentially bullied her and made her life a living hell until she had to go off on sick leave. And she sued the company concerned through the employment tribunal system and ultimately won that case. But it took 2 years and a lot of work by a lot of people in the union to actually get to the point where a payoff was finally ordered by the courts. Now, how many women who don't work in situations where they have decent trade union coverage come back from having children, face that situation, and are essentially bullied out of the workforce after 6 months or a year? The company will say, we didn't break the law, we didn't we didn't make her redundant, we just made her life impossible when she came back to work. Now, you can sue for constructive dismissal, but again, the employment law system in Britain takes years to often get a case going. The government puts as many barriers in your way as possible. It's very, very hard, if not impossible, to get a court-appointed reappointment to your court-ordered reappointment to your old job. Often you may get compensation, but you have to either have a union cover the expenses of taking the employer to court, or you have to cover the cost yourself, which is very prohibitive to most working class women. So most women who are faced with that situation, well, a lot of them will quit and just go and get another job elsewhere. So they, legally speaking, the companies abided by the law, but in actual reality, the woman's working life has suffered as a result of discrimination based on the fact that she's had children. This is the reality. You have this formal equality which can only actually be enforced by having access to like comprehensive legal coverage and a union which is strong enough in the workplace to at least record what's been done to you and be able to present it as evidence at a tribunal. This is what happens in Britain. I'm fairly certain that this is also the case in the United States and in most of Western Europe. Right. JJ's joined us, who says, you're happy to have made it to a live show. Well, good to have you with us. Marius says, an excuse not to analyze economic root causes with reference to the reactionaries. Very true. Iris Partizan says, many of these canteens still exist today here in Belarus, in the state enterprises and universities, where you can have a good, wholesome and nutritious meal for less than a fiver. Well, good luck doing that in Britain. Svetlana comments that Kollontai's father was a Tsarist general. Interesting. Got a few of those people who defected from the other side and joined the cause of the proletariat. Marius says intersectionality really comes to the fore in the 80s and 90s, an extremely vapid discourse that only describes and does not explain social phenomena. Wasn't Bill de Blasio's wife involved with that? Or am I getting that wrong? I'm fairly certain she was involved in like the original like intersectional declaration back in the 80s. Right. Cobra Commander says, sex will never lead to women's liberation or women's empowerment. The very notion is a contradiction in itself. Yes, but it does make an awful lot of money for certain people, certain capitalists. Irish Partisan says, Kollontai's father was a cavalry officer who served in Bulgaria during the Russo-Ottoman War. He also took part in the liberation of Bulgaria. There's a statue to him in Veliko Tarnovo. Interesting. Sid Hatfield says, yes, but pornography, prostitution and promiscuity are viewed as women's liberation. Yeah, that's the Verso Books crowd. And the Novara Media crowd as well, I think. Marius comments, Verso Books has gone from producing serious Marxist text to why my club-footed non-binary orgy polycule is revolutionary. That's coming out next week. Slavoj Žižek's doing the introduction. I'll resist the temptation to do an impression. Marius adds, hello to Zuleika, who joins us. Happy International Working Women's Day to you. Marius says, Kimberly Crenshaw and Judith Butler have been two of the most harmful intellectual figures on Western progressive discourse in the last 30 years. Well, both them and, of course, Slavoj Žižek himself, you know, a man who is as guilty as Judith Butler of injecting pure gibberish into discourse. Dan Lindstrom comments that such canteens exist in Sweden, but a lot of them got privatized. Interesting. Svetlana says, question. Engels, the first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male. In what way did Stalin's pro-family stance alleviate that oppression, if at all? Well, that's an interesting question. Svetlana. I would say that the stance taken by the Soviet leadership in the 1930s coincides with what Irish Partisan's comment was describing earlier on, which is that the awards for having large families, the financial incentive for having large families, was of course something that the Soviet Union did do. Trotsky went crazy about that, excoriating Stalin for collapse into reactionary behavior. I'd say because it went alongside. I mean, first of all, it's by no means perfect. I mean, let's be clear right away about that. But it did go alongside consistent efforts by the Soviet state to incorporate women into the proletariat and to, of course, to raise the cultural and educational level, to make having and raising children something that was much easier to do, and to ensure like the life and health of those children was much better taken care of. So I would say that Stalin's pro-family stance, because it went alongside those consistent efforts to eliminate, or at least much reduce, the discrimination that had taken place against women under capitalism and under Tsardom and under sort of semi-feudalism, overall the picture of the Soviet Union's policies in the 1930s has to be judged to be progressive. Let's see. I would be interesting to see what you think of that yourself as someone who is in Russia and is very much living with still the legacies of the Soviet period, which haven't been completely erased. Hello to Raziel, who's joined us. Cobra Commander says the 1960s was wild for bourgeois. They just had everything, didn't they? Maoism with Jim Jones, insane art expression from Andy Warhol, Hell's Angels bikers for Ho Chi Minh. Well, I don't think the Hell's Angels were for Ho Chi Minh, Cobra Commander, unless I'm getting this wrong. I remember I read Hell's Angels by Hunter S. Thompson, and Thompson in that details how the Hell's Angels that he encountered were all like very much reactionaries. Like, I believe that some of them offered to go to Vietnam to fight Ho Chi Minh personally or something, and made that offer to Johnson or Nixon. Ben says, you're right that this all began in the bourgeois US hippie movement in the 60s, which morphed into the New Left. One of the best articles I've read on this is by the CPGBML, entitled "The Reactionary Nightmare of Gender Fluidity." Yes, an excellent article which I'd encourage everybody to read. Sid Hatfield says, most of these Western Marxists don't have a correct materialist analysis because most of them have never read Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Luxemburg, Liebknecht, or anyone else for that matter. Well, some of them claim to have read Marx. Some of them even claim to have read Lenin. I very much doubt many of them have read Engels. They despise Stalin. Now, Luxemburg's an interesting one because she's been fetishized by a certain variety of Trotskyites because she died before a German Revolution could be fulfilled. And of course, she had many disputes with Lenin, most of which she was completely wrong on. So she's been turned into this tragic martyr, which actually doesn't take into account her actual views or her actual life. But you're right, which is that most of them haven't read most of what Luxemburg said, and they would never read Stalin, and they would never read Mao. And if you tuned into the program we did yesterday, you'll see why reading Stalin is absolutely essential. Aris Partisan says, I had a full course meal on a Belarusian state collective farm in the Gomel region for less than £2. The beef had just come from the cow a few hours earlier. You couldn't get that in a top diner. No, you couldn't. You'd get microwaved shit and you'd pay £30 for it. And of course, it came directly from a Belarusian cow in the collective farm, which, by the way, is, reason to defend the progressive achievements of the Lukashenko government, given that certain of those things were retained. And this is the reason why, of course, the imperialists want to get rid of him, so that they can do to Belarus what they have done to Ukraine. Though I think the miserable fate of what has become of Ukraine under the rule of the compradors should serve as a warning for anybody in Belarus who think that backing Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her banker husband is a good idea. I mean, just look at what these people do when they get hold of one of these ex-Soviet states. Turn it into a playground for imperialism. Cobra Commander says, today the bourgeoisie just got to give folks like Jackson Hinkle Twitter accounts, and these morons show off their intellectual prowess, and just like that there's no anti-war movement. Well, that's an interesting point. Certainly I think that some of these people are deliberately promoted. Where are we now? Zuleika says that Crenshaw and Butler's work suffer the worst of the philosophers to be forgotten. Comrade Hello Hi says, bourgeois identity politics is bad, but discrimination is also bad, and oppressed peoples are an ally to the communist movement. The question is, again, how? Like, you don't, let's go back to the Women's Day quote from Kollontai's article of 1913, which is, it's not that women shouldn't be liberated, it's not that the liberation of proletarian women is not central to the communist movement. It's that trying to include bourgeois thought and insert it into the communist movement does not lead to liberation. It only leads to the dilution of the communist parties and their collapse. And we can test that thesis out by examining the history of what happens when bourgeois thought and social democratic deviations enter into the communist parties. Not just on the issue of the liberation of proletarian women, but on everything else as well. So the problem with a lot of the crap that came from the New Left was that it was all coming from the bourgeoisie, but with left clothing on. That's the problem. Irish Partisan says, in Belarus, paid maternity leave for women is 3 years. I think it's still just about, paid maternity leave here for women, last time I checked, it was 9 months paid under the old company policy of the place I used to work for, and 6 months full paid, 3 months half paid, and then women could take like 3 months unpaid, I think, so a total a year. So in Belarus, paid maternity leave for women is 3 years. Also, if you have 3 or more children, the state provides the option of a free bedroom apartment. Women also get an additional day off work. Well, aren't we all glad that we live in free Britain, where you don't get any of that? All women of the proletarian women in Britain have the same level of equality, same level of existence as men, and that both get completely ripped off and fucked over by the bourgeoisie. Right. Okay, so we are now at 1:15 hour. We're going for just over an hour. So I'm going to bring this one to a close for this afternoon. We're going in the afternoon at the moment because I have other things to do in the evenings. So thank you everybody who's joined in. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And I'll be back to you again with another one of these tomorrow. And until then, I bid you farewell.
Старый камп везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Cuvinte, dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă